Hi everyone. In this presentation, what I'd like to do is to just offer something of a commentary on the reading you've done from Wolf's book, Public Faith. My hope here is sort of twofold. One, I'm hoping that we can dive a bit deeper into several of Wolf's key ideas. And then I'm also going to be spending some time connecting uh, his vision to a Lutheran understanding of the relationship between spirituality and society. And the reason I'm connecting it to that is because I think sort of implicit in Wolf's argument is that human flourishing emerges between these two. And I think it'll be helpful to sort of tease that out a bit. So before going on, let me just name some of the big ideas that I'd like to cover. I'm going to be covering kind of one set of ideas from Wolf's Public Faith and then two sort of, I guess you could say two ideas also from a Lutheran perspective. And of course, understanding these big ideas means that we'll need to discuss several kind of related ideas. All right, so we're going to get started here. And perhaps one of the most important ideas for thinking about public faith is an understanding of the idea of compartmentalization. And most basically, this is the idea that we live our lives in these semi-autonomous spheres. I mean, just think about the way that we talk about our home life or our church life or our work life and so on. And so you can think back to Wolf's chapter on the malfunctions of faith, where he introduces us to the thought of Max Weber and his idea of the rules of the game. Perhaps you remember that Wolf writes there that each sphere, politics, law, business, media, or whatever, it imposes its own rules upon those who wish to participate in it. So we follow the voice of one God at work, another at home, and maybe yet another at church. And each of these spheres resists the claim that one God shapes all of life. And so in a very real sense, we're all polytheists now. So one way this notion of compartmentalization can be seen is in the way that we talk about our lives as both private and also public. And for many Americans, much of life is spent in these two domains. It's easy to think about the things that happen at home with our families as essentially private, while the things that happen beyond the home, like work, those things are in a sense public. And congregational life then is pretty complicated because it's neither home nor work, and so sometimes we're a little confused about where to put it. In one sense, we, especially as Lutherans, think about our public worship, but oftentimes the metaphors we use for our congregational life sound more like that private realm of the family. So sometimes we say our church family and other kinds of metaphors for thinking about what the church is. And sometimes the language we use for the church kind of pushes it into that privatized domain of our life, into that compartment of our life. And so this kind of brings us to the central question, I think, which is what kind of public life is Jesus calling us to? Now, there's many reasons, I think, why living out a sort of reasonable, faithful answer to this question is pretty difficult. And Chris Sharon has pointed out that our churches provide both personal affirmation and care for their members, and they also create social networks, which can provide for a sort of important site for organizing around shared values, shared concerns. Yet Americans often find it difficult to connect the local sense of community that they find in a congregation to the large-scale forces and institutions that shape our lives. Now, at the same time, other researchers, such as Nancy Ammerman, has pointed out that despite how hard it is for many individuals and congregations to make this connection to public life, her own research suggests that communities of faith remain important agents for forming American public life. She writes this, that local congregations are among the most important institutional sources for moral education and for voluntary engagement in local community social service. The pervasiveness of local congregations and their network of affiliated organizations make them powerful players in a social service delivery system, and the institutional patterns that shape congregational life in the United States mean that they are expected to provide opportunities for worship, for education, for fellowship and mutual care, and also service to the broader community. And so connecting congregational life to public life is both an incredible challenge, and yet it's vitally important, not just for the sake of the gospel or even for the church, but for our very communities and for our public lives together. So when we ask this central question about the kind of public life Jesus is calling us to, part of what we're talking about is those parts of our lives that are shaped by congregations and by other institutions. Now, at the same time, we're also talking about something even more basic than that. And so, before we go any further, I'd like to just unpack this idea of the private and this public dichotomy that we often operate out of. When scholars enter discussions like these, they often have in mind the well-known German philosopher George Hegel. That's because Hegel introduced what was in his day a novel idea, that of the civil society. Curiously, what exactly he meant by this idea is a sort of a matter of endless debate. But what is clear is that it's a domain of life that belongs neither entirely to the state nor to the individual. And so for him, this domain of the civil society encapsulates two distinct kinds of action, public action and political action. Now, often today, we sort of confuse these terms and we use them interchangeably. But following Hegel, we could say that the public refers to more than mere politics. Perhaps to clarify things, we should maybe even talk about one more word, policy. So now we have these kind of three P words in our mind: public, politics, and policy. Maybe let's get some definitions on the table to help us out. Now, public is the broadest of these terms, and it has multiple meanings. Now, most basically, it means the people, like as in we the people. But it also means a quality of openness or accessibility, as in a public library or a publicly traded company. Together, these first two meanings help show that in a very basic way, to talk about our public lives is to talk about our common lives, what we share in common. But there's also one more meaning that we need to consider. Public also means to be being altered, as in the root of the word puberty, or that developmental stage in which a young person begins to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions and so forth. So let's talk about those other two words. We have three definitions there for public, and I want you to keep those in mind. But let's think a little bit now about the other two words. Policy. Policy refers to the ends of our public or collective life and our politics. Politics is usually the means by which we enact those policies. And so most often when we use this language to think about the official policies and politics of our public lives, that's a lot of P's. But it's also good to keep in mind that these play out in unofficial and unspoken ways as well. Now, think back for a moment to Wolff's chapter on human flourishing and the way that he writes there of this idea of experiential satisfaction. Now, when Wolff writes about this in that chapter, he's thinking primarily about a sort of personal, or sometimes what we would say a subjective experience, a sort of center of value, you could say, because what Wolff is getting at here is that the very meaning of our lives is based in some ways on the degree to which we feel satisfied. And I want to connect this idea to a larger frame that I think might be helpful for us to think more deeply with. And that's the idea of individualism. Well, to get at this, I want to think for a moment uh, with you about some observations that were made about American religion in the 1820s. This is just to show you how long this has sort of been going, how long we've been trying to think about the relationship between faith and public life in this country. In the 1820s, this guy named Alexis de Tocqueville, he had this great set of observations. In the 1920s, he goes around, travels all around America, making notes in his journal. And one of the things that he observed there is that the church is the first of America's political institutions. He made this kind of stunning observation about the way that congregations, that local churches actually play out in local communities, the role they have to play. He also, though, talked about a pervasive sense of individualism in American society. He writes about it this way. He says, individualism is a calm and considered feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and to withdraw to a circle of family and friends with his little society formed to his taste. He gladly leaves the greater society to look after itself. Now, individualism is kind of a way of naming this tendency in our society to allow our private affairs to dominate like any conversation we might want to have about our shared and public lives. And a version of this can be seen in the Religion Dispatches article you read, where I was criticizing the dominance of this freedom from language in our public debates about religious freedom. And both what Wolf calls experiential satisfaction and what I'm more broadly naming as individualism here can be seen as sort of ego-centered visions. Now hold on to that because it'll become important in a few minutes when we begin to talk about a key Lutheran insight. But before I sort of go on, I want to review, for some of you this may be review, for some of you this may be hearing it for maybe the first time, or either way, it'll be good review, I think. So I want to mention a couple of Lutheran insights that we can begin to put in conversation with Wolf. One is I want to talk a little bit about this idea of Luther's called, sometimes called two kinds of righteousness or two kingdoms, and his notion of the cor curvum in se, which is just Latin for the heart turned in on itself. So let's talk a little bit about what Luther meant by two kingdoms. Luther wrote that the kingdom of God works actually in two ways. But it's important to think about these as sort of strategies, not spheres of life, like we were just talking about a minute ago when we were talking about compartmentalization. Even though kingdom to our ears sometimes sounds like a spatial metaphor, right? There's a kingdom over here and a kingdom over there. That's not quite what Luther had in mind. Luther really means it as two strategies by which God makes God's will happen. And at times he refers to these as the kingdom of earth or the kingdom of man, and in its corresponding one, of course, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. At other times he simply talks about them as the left hand and the right hand, with the left referring to the kingdom of earth and the right hand belonging to the other. So here on earth, we still live with the consequences of sin, and we are a broken people. And it's only in the kingdom of the right hand, kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, that there is ever a complete reconciliation, right? And so when it came to thinking about our common public lives, Luther wrote that God has provided governance to actually order these kingdoms. And on the left hand, God makes use of broken systems and structures to bring about God's will. And of course, on the right hand, in the kingdom of heaven, God is totally sovereign, and God's will is just always done. In this way, Luther's actually very fond of political order, of state authority. Even though both church and state were located in the kingdom of the left hand for Luther, they had separate messages, you might say, separate missions. Each kingdom is, not a sphere of life, but it is a strategy towards a goal. Or maybe to put it differently, we could say that the church had a spiritual authority, and the state had a temporal one. He wrote a treatise about the latter, about temporal authority, and there he lays much of this out. He's got a great quote there that I want to share with you. I think it's helpful. He says there that just as the Christian performs all other works of love which he himself does not need, he does not visit the sick in order that he himself may be made well, or feed others because he himself needs food. He serves the governing authority not because he needs it, but for the sake of others, and that they may be protected, and that the wicked may not become worse. This way of thinking about service to temporal authority fits pretty squarely into Luther's broader theology of vocation, which you might be familiar with. But if you aren't, the quick, fast, and cheap version of it, of course, is just that it flows right out of Luther's understanding of justification, in which it's not us and our salvation which needs good works. It's not God that needs our good works. It's our neighbor that needs good works. And so a vocation is any place where we are called to serve and love our neighbor. Now, this does not mean, however, that temporal authority is without its limits, and that Christians should always obey that authority. If ever the temporal authority stands in the way of loving one's neighbor, or if their actions prove to be obstacles of faith, if they cause one to lose faith, then they shouldn't even be obeyed to begin with. Remember, it's the emperor himself that Luther said no to when such a temporal authority demanded he recant his own writings, So this is a very kind of clear way that Luther moves forward in this question about public faith, yeah? So I want to just sum this up. So Luther saw a great potential for partnership between the church and state, since after all, both kingdoms, the left and the right, were ultimately governed by God. Now, the second idea is less often talked about, I would say, among Lutherans. The good news is, though, it's not a very complicated one. So for Luther, we might say that the primary challenge of the spiritual life was that of guilt. He once said that if there was ever a good little monk, it was him, that he did all the right prayers and penitence and all of that, but nothing he did could ever satisfy this profound sense of guilt. And so he talked about this persistent guilt, and he talked about it as the cor curvum in se, which is, again, just Latin for the heart turned in on itself. Now, curiously, Dietrich Bonhoeffer also picked this up, and while for Luther the primary challenge was guilt, Bonhoeffer came to see ego as the major hurdle. And so if you want to think about those are, in a sense, those are two pretty closely related ideas. But if you want to think a bit more about what happened between Luther and Bonhoeffer, to trace these two views and kind of think about why it was that Luther named the core sort of spiritual challenges guilt and Bonhoeffer ego, go back and read Wolff's pages 58 to 60, and you'll see a shift kind of at work. But either way, Luther and Bonhoeffer, for both of them, the only way to move beyond this heart's turning in on itself was to pattern one's life in a way that made others the center of its love and service and its very meaning. And so I think this can be a really helpful Lutheran insight to think quite critically and constructively about what Wolff is naming when he talks about in human flourishing, and he talks about when he talks about that idea of existential satisfaction. Yeah. Okay, I'd like to talk for just a moment now about about our final kind of big idea here, secularization, and its twin brother, as I like to call it, privatization. Now, Max Weber, who we mentioned a moment ago, is often thought of as the father of sociology. He writes poignantly about the effect that Luther's ideas and the Reformation that followed had on German society. He writes that before Luther, there were clear distinctions between that which we might call the secular and that what we might call the sacred. In reference to Luther's priesthood of all believers, he notes that when the monastery walls came down, there were no longer two distinct worlds, right? Just one, and that was a secular one. The social and political developments that followed Luther and his Reformation, they dramatically reshape Europe and consequently Europe's colonies. So when the German princes stood up to the emperor to protect Luther, they opened the door to this whole idea of a nation state. The printing press that printed Luther's German Bible, it initiated a huge educational reforms. And so during the Reformation, new religious and political structures emerged throughout Germany and Geneva and in England. Now, one stunning result of all of this was an unprecedented religious diversity. Simply didn't exist before. Now, jumping ahead a bit in that story of religious diversification, you might say, many of those who settled the American colonies were, of course, religious outcasts. They were displaced by religious commitments and visions. And there's a sense in which the American experiment has always been fertile ground for religious experimentation and innovation. And that's because it's this sense of diversity has always led, or hasn't always, but it led inevitably, of course, to the idea of a separation of church and state. And that's an idea that stood really in stark contrast to the pattern of state churches that develop in Europe. And those are, of course, themselves a direct result of the Reformation. Now, part of what Weber observed in his lifetime was that with these new social and political arrangements came a kind of what he called a natural differentiation. And it's pretty related to what we've been calling compartmentalization, although it's a bit different. Now, by that he means that certain institutions were responsible for certain domains. Weber names three. He talks about the church, the state, and the market. Now, perhaps you can see how this was, in a sense, quite a natural extension of Luther's two kingdoms, a spiritual and a temporal authority. Now the temporal authority is sort of split in two. You have a sort of legal authority on the one hand, and an economic authority, an economic engine on the other hand. Now, throughout the 19th and 20th century, big changes continue, of course. Industrialization, science and technology advances. These lead to further specialization and to further differentiation. And so by the mid-20th century, the social conditions in what we would call industrialized societies, they lead some theorists to offer some hypotheses about the future of religion. And I want to talk a little bit about that for a minute. One of the most popular hypotheses about the future of religion in modern society comes from Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. They have a really influential book called The Sacred Canopy. And Luckman and Berger, they posited that in Western societies, when they were faced with so much religious diversity, that the mere availability of other options will cause them to secularize. And what do they mean by this? Well, by this they mean that societies will enter a process in which sectors, or you can call them spheres, domains, of society and culture are removed from the domination or influence, right, of religious institutions. And when we speak of a society and institutions in modern Western history, secularization manifests itself in the evacuation by the Christian churches of areas previously under their control or influence. It's kind of a tricky deal there, isn't it? Now, basically what they're suggesting is in an inevitable secularization, or at least privatization of religion, where religion no longer will matter in the public life, but only in one's private life. They actually go on to argue that this is an empirical reality, and that the hypothesis here is that the more and more society modernizes, the more and more it will become secularized in this way. And of course, eventually the result would be the total decline of religion. Well, that was a theory anyways. As it really turned out, it's really interesting. Peter Berger was one of the first to bring forward this thesis, what's sometimes called the secularization thesis. But that's not exactly how things turned out. Peter Berger himself was actually one of the first to disclaim this thesis. Basically, data rolled in the 70s and the 80s, and it proved to not be the case. In the 1980s, religion actually exploded, and in particular, it was conservative religious belonging and new religious movements that proved that actually there was no such thing as a sort of one-to-one correspondence between modernization and secularization. The two really didn't have that kind of relationship at all. Now, contemporary theorists today often admit that the thesis of Luckman and Berger's didn't quite pan out. But they also note that religion today is more privatized, right? That it didn't just go away, but it has been limited to our private lives. That is, that beliefs that are often thought of as more subjective, a matter of personal choice, and not something that is established or assumed to be shared across the diversity of people that exist in modern life. So the question that we started with, right, how can Christians today engage in public faith, is one that we're going to hold on to for the remainder of the course. But I'd like to invite you to begin working with some of these big ideas. Here's how this is going to work. I'm going to bring back this slide from the beginning of our little presentation here. And what I would like you to do is, in a moment, I'm going to show you, you'll have to actually click forward in the video here, but I'm going to show you 3 video clips. And each one, as I said this morning, is a media story that includes faith active in public life. What I want you to do is, at the end of each video, there's a prompt. I want you to use some of the concepts in this presentation to help us better understand the video clip itself. Help us understand what's happening. Do that by offering commentary, by posing questions that you would want to ask, questions that you would want to ask of this situation. When we gather back together tomorrow morning, Tuesday morning, we will discuss your interactions with this presentation, but we'll also have some time to ask questions. I'm going to put you in pairs, maybe small groups, depending on how you decide to interact with this video. And we're also going to do some role playing. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, and thanks so much for letting me be a part of the course.